Good afternoon, everyone. So today we are going to discuss about if citizens should be required to vote in national elections. So on my left side, I have the affirmative team that is Ana Luisa and Luana, and on my right side, I have the negative team that is Ana Luisa and Isabella. So we are going to start by the presentation of the affirmative team. So you have 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. The debate's proposal is whether voting should or not be mandatory. The affirmative team defends that citizens should be required to vote on national elections, because even if this is an unanimous choice, at least the president would be chosen the most democratic way. In that sense, that the entire population votes were considered for this decision. Now we would like to define some terms such as the word compulsory, which means obligatory, and democracy, which, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is a system where the whole population elects a representative by popular vote. So without further ado, let's start with our arguments. The affirmative team's first argument defends that when voting is mandatory, all parties must try their best to please and represent the whole population. That way, the government is obligated to please general necessities. This manner makes politicians more authentic and makes sure no groups are neglected. Our second argument defends that no democracy is a genuine democracy if not all members participate in it. If we keep in mind that the definition of a democracy is a system where the whole population elects a president, then not making voting mandatory goes against it. So here's an example to contextualize this argument. For example, in 2016, the voting turnout in the United States of America was about of 61.4%. That way, it doesn't represent the whole population's opinion, since almost half of it didn't take part in it. And the last argument defends that no one can represent a citizen's interests better than themselves. The affirmative side believes that the reason why people vote is because they want to make changes on topics they aren't happy about. That way, making voting mandatory would assure every citizen has the right to decide how they want to see themselves represented in the government, and what the government can do in order to conquer those ideas. Just like Obama once said in a speech in Ohio, the people who tend to not vote are young, they're lower income, they're skewed more heavily toward immigrant groups and minorities. So there's a reason why some folks try to keep them away from the polls. And considering what was said in his speech, making voting mandatory would assure those minorities groups will vote and represent their ideas through the government. I end my speech.
Thank you. Any questions?
So we are going to do the cross-examination.
You have 1 minute.
So you think that by forcing people to do something that they don't want to do, there will be a raise in awareness?
No. We believe that it's not really about making people do something they don't agree with. It's about giving options to people to choose what they think is the best choice for them. So, it's always an option to vote blank or to cast a ballot. So it's not forcing them.
Thank you. So we are going to follow with the presentation by the negative group. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So the concern of this debate relates to the analysis of whatever system is better for the citizens, the one that implement mandatory voting or the one that implement voluntary ones. So during this debate, we'll be defending the negative aspects of implementing mandatory voting in the society. Therefore, we will start by redefining the term democracy, which is government with the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised directly by them or by their elected agents under a free electoral system. So the main arguments are, firstly, that in democratic countries, the choice to vote or not is a political right. Therefore, you cannot force somebody to vote in a democratic society. So, according to the Human Rights Article 19, the document grants that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes the freedom to hold opinion without interference to state. According to the fine law side, the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States affirms that Congress shall make no law disrespecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise, therefore abridging the freedom of speech or the press. So we believe that if the voting was mandatory, it would violate the human rights and the Constitution. So it would obligate people to vote even if they do not want to. So our second argument is that if people are since young educated, the voting is important to construct a democracy. Every citizen would vote with the willing to feel represented in the government. Consequently, there would be no necessity to implement a mandatory vote. As reported by the Guardian site, the longer American stayed in school, more likely he or she is to register the vote. So 21% of the adults who left school before 9th grade voted. On the other hand, 74% of the adults who had an advanced degree voted. So we believe that if people are taught in school that voting is something essential for establishing a democracy, they would vote in a conscious and deliberate way, and this way is a much more effective way of achieving knowledge than obligating people to do something. So our third argument is that some politicians may manipulate parts of the society that are more vulnerable by offering benefits that they need, and such action is unethical and illegal. So, according to the El País site, Pernambuco, that is a state in Brazil, registered the most complaints of electoral crimes. So there are 18 complaints per day, and 74% of them are about irregular advertisement. So we believe that politicians may manipulate parts of the society that are more vulnerable by offering benefits that they need. And for instance, in Brazil, they offer food and clothing, and this action can be considered illegal. That's it.
Thank you. So, any cross-examination or questions?
Yes. So you were talking about how education is important when it comes to choosing your president, right? So we would like to ask, like, what about the emerging countries, for example, where education is not as good? Those people don't have the same level of education as places like Japan and like Germany, for example.
So we actually found out that the cost to law enforce the mandatory vote is high, so it makes it cost more than the voluntary vote, and this money could be invested in the education that will lead to a better education, of course, and to people voting in a conscious way and knowing what they're doing and the value of the vote. So that's it.
Thank you. So we are going to the next topic, that is the rebuttal of the affirmative team. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Our first counter-argument is about the negatives argument. In countries with good education, the children are always taught the importance of voting, so people are more conscious of their choices. Some countries which implement mandatory voting do have high literacy rates, as Luxembourg, around 100% of its population literate, and Australia, which is around 99%. On the other hand, the UK and the USA are countries that have high literacy rates, but in the UK, the voting turnout was about 64% in 2017, and in the USA, the voting turnout was around 65% in 2016. Our second rebuttal is about your argument, politicians could manipulate vulnerable people into voting on them. According to the Australian Council of Social Service, in Australia, 13% of the country's population lives in poverty, a number that would not affect this election's result, as in Belgium, where the poverty rate in 2017 was around 15%. Furthermore, Luxembourg and some parts of Switzerland implement compulsory voting and are very rich countries. And our third counter-argument is about the negatives argument. More developed countries don't have mandatory voting. Even though countries like USA and Japan don't have mandatory voting, countries like Luxembourg and Switzerland, which are included in the list of the richest countries in the world, do implement mandatory voting. Not only that, but Luxembourg has the highest GDP per capita in the world. Australia is the second richest country based on wealth per adult, being ahead of the USA. Furthermore, Switzerland is the richest one, and some parts of the country implement compulsory voting. Belgium and Singapore are one of the top 10 richest countries based on wealth per adult, and these countries also implement.
Okay, thank you. Your time's up. Any questions?
So I have two questions for you. So, did you know that the voting in Switzerland were only implemented in Schaffhausen, and that it only represents 1% of Swiss population? And furthermore, are you saying that because Australia poverty is not like big enough, the manipulation in other countries doesn't count or isn't valuable?
First, we didn't know that it was just 1%, and so thank you for this information. And we didn't say that. We just wanted to give an example with Australia to show that not necessarily the manipulation and the population would affect the elections result. Thank you.
Thank you. So now the negative team is going to present their rebuttal. You have 2 minutes.
So our first counter-argument is based on the affirmative argument that if the vote is mandatory, people will be forced to be aware and always researching about the government and what they are doing. According to the International Idea Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance site, the compulsory election increased the number of random votes, led by the will of the citizen to vote. And as reported by the site The Globe and Mail, the quantity of voters do not mean there is an increase in awareness. Moreover, they also affirm that it may even not change the final outcome of the elections. Based on what we researched, the mandatory vote does not increase the awareness of people to our political issues, because many people vote randomly. That is, they do not care for whom they are voting. Our second counterargument is based on the affirmative argument that the mandatory vote is something more democratic, since all parts of the population are voting. Democracy exists when there is the choice of the citizen to vote or not. It is possible to affirm that because according to the definition given of democracy before, democracy is government by the people, a form of government with a free electoral system. People who live in countries which have the mandatory vote suffer consequences if they do not vote. In this way, there is a consequences such as infringements of civil rights or disenfranchisement. It is, for example, possible that the non-voter, after not voting in at least 4 elections within 15 years, will be disenfranchised in Belgium. Therefore, the non-voter is penalized, something that can affect his citizen life. Our last counter-argument is based on the mandatory voting. There is the blank vote. In this way, nobody is forced to choose for whom they want to vote. As reported by the site G1, the numbers of blank votes or abstentions increased in the last election in Brazil. Analyzing this data, it is possible to affirm that people are no longer knowing the value of the vote.
Okay, thank you. Your time's up. Any cross-examination or questions? Okay, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. Could you please clarify the meaning of the word disenfranchisement? We didn't understand it quite well.
Yes, of course. Disenfranchisement is when the citizens will be prevented from exercising their rights.
Thank you.
So now the negative team will present their conclusion. You have 1 minute.
So, therefore, the negative side concludes that according to the Article 19 from the Human Rights and to the definition of democracy, citizens have the right to decide if they want to vote or not. Moreover, if people were since young educated that voting is important to construct a democracy, every citizen would vote with the willingness to feel represented in the government. Consequently, there would be no necessity to implement the mandatory vote. Furthermore, in most countries that have the mandatory voting, there is the vote buying made by politicians on the poorest vulnerable areas, affecting the voice and the expression of these people. Thus, we are sure that no mandatory voting brings more benefits for citizens than compulsory voting. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So we are going to follow with the conclusion of the affirmative.
Thank you. So after this debate, the affirmative side concluded that it is important for the countries to implement the system of compulsory voting. When it comes to emerging countries, since their education is not as good as the developed countries, mandatory voting would be an encouragement to vote. However, when it comes to developed countries, even though a good education system helps, it doesn't necessarily mean that the citizens will actually vote. As an example, the voting turnout in the USA usually isn't high. Concluding, we believe that compulsory voting is effective and important for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, and sorry for the laughs. So now I'm going to judge you. So I think the both arguments were good, but in my opinion, the negative side arguments were stronger and more like supported. So I'm going to vote for the negative side.